So good afternoon and good morning to all of you that are tuned into our Transatlantic Tuesday. On behalf of the German Marshall Fund of the United States, my name is Suda David Wilp, and I'd like to welcome you all to this Transatlantic Tuesday run by the Berlin office. Transatlantic Tuesday is a monthly meetup that we've held virtually now for almost 2 years to talk about pertinent issues on both sides of the Atlantic. It's a pleasure to have you with us. Today, we're going to talk about France and its response to the war in Ukraine, and also particularly in the run-up to the French election, how the war is playing out in terms of the campaign. So please send your questions, use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. Those will automatically queue up. As always, we'll have a short conversation and then go to you for questions. I'd like to thank our Business Alliance for making this series possible at the German Marshall Fund. And now I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Joseph de Weck, who will introduce my two colleagues, Edgar Tam and Alexandra. Joseph is a historian and author. He's head of the Europe program at a consulting firm and an astute observer of French politics. He wrote a book in 2021 about Macron titled Emmanuel Macron, the Revolutionary President. And he's a fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia and a columnist for Internationale Politik. Joseph, the floor is yours.
Many thanks, Suda, and welcome all to this month's edition of the Transatlantic Tuesday, where we will discuss France and the Ukraine-Russia crisis and France's response in the Western war. Let me start quickly by introducing our two panelists that are joining me from Paris and from the West Coast. So in Paris, we have Alexandra de Scheffer, whom I hardly need to present to you. She's the director of the Paris office, as well as the director of research of transatlantic relations at the German Marshall Fund. In this capacity, Alexandra is a prolific writer of op-eds and a key voice on the French and European debate on transatlantic relations. In a previous life, she has worked on transatlantic relations at the policy planning staff of the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and she's also an associate professor at Sciences Po in Paris, my old university. On the other side of the Atlantic, and even from the Pacific, we have joining Edgar Tam. Edgar has joined the GMF's Paris office as a visiting fellow in the summer of 2020. He is currently on a stint at the GMF, but normally works at the US Department of Defense. He has joined the DoD in 2004 and has been covering China and Iran, amongst others. So Edgar is a real Washington insider, but of course, Edgar will speak today strictly in his own capacity. His analysis will not necessarily reflect the positions of the US government. So many thanks for being with us, and we'll start the conversation now. We will open the floor for questions after about 25 minutes. So please, if you have any questions during the conversation, please use the Q&A function and we'll pick up these questions later. And to give Edgar a couple of more minutes to wake up since he's on the West Coast, I will start with Alexandra first. So in Germany, the government classifies Russia's invasion of Ukraine as a sort of sea change moment that changes everything from Berlin's position on defense spending to its longstanding Russia policy based on dialogue and trade. So what has been Macron's Russia policy in the past? And is Russia's invasion also a similar sea change moment for Paris or not?
Thank you so much, Joseph. I hope you can hear me well.
Yes, we can.
And sorry, but it's all my fault if we have started slightly late. I have been having technical issues, but very, very happy to be part of this conversation. Let me be brief. I think we all share the same assessment in Berlin, in Paris, in Warsaw, where GMF actually has offices in Brussels as well. I think this war in Ukraine, certainly marks in a very brutal way a new era in Europe. And that's the assessment of President Macron and the entire French political class, even though there are some nuance, obviously, but this has, there has not been an attack of this scale on a sovereign country in Europe since the Second World War. And with the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Iron Curtain, peace in Europe has been taken for granted. And now the Russian invasion has changed this equation and has drastically changed the way France perceives Russia. Obviously, Joseph, you rightly, mentioned that there has been some shifts in French policy. We all remember President Macron hosting President Putin in the Chateau de Versailles. He has, tried what I would qualify sort of reset policy with the Russian President Putin. Tried to do what probably President Obama and then Trump have not succeeded in doing, which was trying to redefine a constructive foreign policy with Russia. It has totally failed, totally collapsed. President Macron has been, criticized, if I use a euphemism, by many of our European partners for, choosing a unilateral way of approaching the policy, the relationship with President Putin. And I must say that, having been part of these many conversations, European, Franco-American, transatlantic conversation on Europe's relationship with Russia, it's true that France has for several years now certainly, and this is a lessons learned of this war, this Russian war in Ukraine, underestimated its Baltic, Europe, Central, Eastern European partners. Alerts saying that the threat posed by Russia is a serious threat, and you French are underestimating that threat, and you're extending your hand to Putin while he is threatening Europe's security. And so I must say that what we have seen in the French political scene and in President Macron's diplomatic cell and government more broadly is a drastic change, twofold. One, first in the method, the way Macron is now much more consulting with its Baltic, Eastern, Central partners before consulting or extending, or opening channels or trying to keep channels of communication open with Putin despite the very complicated situation. I think this has been a lessons learned to be less unilateral and much more consultative when it comes to the Russian policy. And the second thing it has drastically changed is the way France and Macron probably perceives the threat posed by Russia. And from a French perspective, it's maybe something that is not fully understood in other European capitals. The Russian security threat is multi-geographic, if I can say, because we have this also this geographical position that makes the southern flank, if I can say, also a priority for France. And the Mali situation is a situation where we have issues with Russia as well. The Wagner mercenaries have pretty much kicked out France or are threatening France's security interest in Africa as well. So there is this, I would say, double geographical perspective, eastward, but also southward for France. And I'll just end this introductory remark by saying, yes, this has been a brutal a brutal awakening for France. It's also I would say a total rethink of, European security, of obviously Europeans' borders as well. And so there is a beginning of a reflection also of, I would say, a forward-looking perspective when it comes to the future, what we call, and it's I know it's a term that has been used a lot, but this future architecture of security, order and security, European security, it's something that Macron has tried to advance in the past years, but that now has a totally different, I would say, flavor to it. And lastly, because this is also important to keep in mind when we try to understand the French position today vis-a-vis the Russian invasion in Ukraine, we don't see it as a Ukraine issue, but as a broader regional issue. And that's also, I would say, feeds into what President Macron has been trying to impose in the French political debate and the broader European debate, is that we need to pay much more attention to the Balkan region, right? And we see that there is a lot of concern of a potential spillover effect and destabilization of the Balkan countries. And so we see a French diplomatic effort also this past year, and that is confirmed with this Russian invasion of Ukraine, that we need to reinvest politically, diplomatically, the Balkan region. And I think that this is something that we could definitely discuss in a transatlantic setting. I'll stop here in terms of introducing the topic.
Many thanks, Alexandra. I'll now turn to Edgar to get sort of the US perspective. Macron and the Biden administration didn't really start off easily. There was this AUKUS drama that was a big theme in Paris. So what about today? How does Washington see sort of France's role in the crisis, in the build-up to the crisis, but also now that the war has actually begun? And how do they perceive Macron's continued diplomatic efforts with Putin?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Joseph. I think to sort of set the framework, you had talked about AUKUS. I do think AUKUS drives some of the approach by the United States today. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is, I think there's a keen sense in Washington that with the AUKUS fallout, we actually had not been approaching some of our closest European allies, including France, in sort of a concerted effort. I think the Europeans in the aftermath of AUKUS, in particular the French, of course, felt as though Washington's negotiations with Russia in particular were sort of unwarranted, given that, as Alexandra had just said, France views Russia as part of a European problem. So I think the White House and the administration today are very much aware that they need to coordinate much more closely. And we have seen that. We have seen that through the sharing of intelligence, probably, as some experts have indicated, the most efficient use, the most effective use of intelligence to get our partners and allies on board in the post-Cold War period. And it has had the effect of rallying our partners and allies, in particular France. We've involved Europeans in the conversation, the United States has, literally from the beginning. And to demonstrate this, of course, we're all aware of the Russian ultimatum letter that they sent to the United States, in which the US coordinated very closely, in particular with President Macron, to ensure that it was a European response and not only a US response. With regards to France, I think the American administration understands that France has a particularly unique role to play, not only in keeping open lines of communication with Russia, which the United States, we don't necessarily have right now at the head of state level, but also in terms of his position as a regional leader, solidifying I think, as Alexandra alluded to, his position as a security leader for Europe. Just as Alexandra mentioned, President Macron very much does view Russia as part of the European sphere. He has since he became president. He has had to explain to people throughout why he is increasing his relationship with Russia. And I think the American administration is starting to realize this, in part because we want to give President Macron diplomatic and political space to be the leader he wants to be in Europe, but also in part because we recognize that after AUKUS, the French president, we can complement our goals with the United States and how France is leading on the Russia issue. Now, just a quick word about some criticism of President Macron in the American administration and in some Western countries. Look, my personal experience, opinion is that this criticism is unwarranted. I think those who criticize Macron's outreach to Putin, I think he's spoken with Putin some more than a dozen times now since December. I think it's unwarranted. Diplomacy is not black and white. I think President Macron understands that. In fact, it is necessary and it is great. And I think President Macron is quite a strategic thinker. In a visit to Poland a few years ago, he received a lot of criticism from the Polish thinkers and the political officials for his approach to Russia. And I think the New York Times reported this. What was interesting was President Macron's comeback to this criticism. He says, one, Russia is a European country, and two, in order to draw Russia away from China, I need to remain friends with Russia. And I think that shows you just how strategic minded he is in his approach with Russia.
In this context, a good question to follow up is that there is a EU-China virtual summit, coming up on April 1. Macron has said he wants to, engage Russia to get them away from China. What does Washington expect from Europeans to happen, at this EU-China summit? What are they looking for? What are the expectations?
Well, I think as you pointed out, and as we had talked about earlier, China is still, what we call in the United States, the pacing threat. And so what we'll be looking for, I think, the United States in particular, in this upcoming EU-China summit is really President Macron demonstrating that he can use his influence and leverage, both as French president and also right now as leader of the European Union, the presidency, to really get the 27 nations on board, have a consolidated, comprehensive approach to how they view China today in terms of the Russia-Ukraine crisis. And I think we're starting to see very strong signals of that. Of course, the EU, during the EU summit coming up, not the summit, but the meeting with the president on the sidelines, I think this week, they invited Japan to be part of this conversation. There's messaging from European countries, in particular the Elysee, that part of the discussion is going to be looking at China in the context of the Russia-Ukraine crisis. And so I think they're already taking some very good steps in showing the United States and other countries that they're serious about, imposing some cost to China if China, as the news is reporting, is willing to send arms and help Russia evade sanctions.
Alexandra, France is also having a presidential election in the midst of all of that. How does this play in? We have presidential elections in June, legislative elections. Is Macron completely absorbed by these elections or completely absorbed by the war?
I think this war is absorbing everyone, and on the whole French political landscape is completely taken by that. And it's as though we're not really having a presidential election. It's not even on the French, I would say, citizens' mind. Everyone is really obsessed by what's going on in Ukraine. And there is also, shared with other citizens of other Western societies, a certain amount of frustration and interrogations in terms of saying, why are political leaders not doing more in that particular crisis. So this is a real debate that we're having here in Paris, and that resonates in many other capitals, including in Washington, DC, where more than 70% of Americans in a latest public opinion poll would be in favor of a no-fly zone over Ukraine, even though, of course, no one really is aware of the specificities of the technologies of how do you install a no-fly zone, but it's very revealing. So I would say everyone is really absorbed by that. But what's interesting is that it has also triggered a lot of debates about how each candidate positions itself vis-a-vis Russia. And you have this extreme right candidate, Mélenchon, you have the extreme right candidates, Marine Le Pen, Éric Zemmour, who all had a sort of, a relationship to Russia and to Putin, where it was saying, well, he's a leader with whom we can discuss, we should invest in Russia, a much warmer kind of relationship. And so Macron has been through an accelerated transition, if I can say, out from his outreaching approach with Putin to a more realistic approach. And so he has been alerting the rest of the political class that France needed to, if I can say, update its lenses through which it worked and perceived Russia as a player in Europe and on the global political scene. And you've seen exactly the same, I would say, induced transition in Berlin, where Olaf Scholz, had been campaigning on being a Merkel bis, number 2, and then realized that he had to go through this post-Merkel transition, accelerated by Russian invasion in Ukraine. So there is this transition in many European capitals. You feel it in Paris. And it's true that this war is giving a certain amount of, I would say, legitimacy to Macron, where he can argue in his meetings, etc., that he is the president, he is managing this crisis, and that he is, of course, managing also the French presidency of the EU. So he uses that also as a way of portraying himself as the most credible player in that very difficult context. And it's true that if you compare Macron and the other presidential candidates, it's not even comparable. So it gives him, if I can say, an additional layer of legitimacy, even though we can say, well, what has his outreach strategy with Putin? What results has he delivered? You can say, well, nothing. Well, let's see if it's really nothing at the end of the day. And last thing I want to say, we are very, very Western obsessed. It's the West against Russia. I think we should get out of that dichotomy, that black and white. I think it doesn't really make sense. And I would even be slightly provocative by saying maybe the West is not even part of the game anymore. When you see that it's Turkey hosting the Russian-Ukraine negotiation, when you see Ukraine reaching out to Israel as a mediator as well, you realize that it's not NATO, it's not the EU, it's not the US in the driving diplomatic seat, it's non-Western countries. And so you have also, and this is not new, but this crisis is confirming it, a phenomenon of de-Westernization, both of military intervention and crisis diplomacy. We were used to do that as Western powers, but after 20 years of war against terrorism, all societies are fed up and say, we don't want to intervene, but you have other powers that are ready to intervene. And this is where we need to react to ways of military intervention that we were not used to anymore. And so it puts us in an uncomfortable position where we have to deal with authoritarian leaders And obviously, neither NATO, nor the EU leaders, nor the United States actually have the right mechanism to deal with these types of leaders. And I include, of course, China, Russia, and other powers. I just wanted to put that out there because we're very Western focused, but everything is happening outside of the, if I can say, the Western bloc, actually.
It has been mentioned before, you know, Macron, his comments about NATO brain dead 2019 looks pretty stupid today with hindsight. So in a sense, this crisis has completely invalidated Macron's analysis of the Russian threat. But at the same time, he's using it to advance the sort of idea of strategic autonomy, and it gives a lot of legitimacy to this idea as well. So in a sense, is he being invalidated and proven right?
No, I think it's really both. I mean, it was a very provocative, and it was, you know, deliberately so. And he has actually said that he still maintained his, you know, but these are just words, if I can say. But what we are underestimating from the Berlin, the Warsaw, the Baltic perspective is that France always is still perceived, despite the decision in 2009 of President Sarkozy to have France reintegrate the integrated military command of NATO. France is still perceived as a sort of ambiguous member state of NATO. It's not, it's anti-NATO, it's anti-US, it wants strategic autonomy from the US, from NATO, completely obsessed with the EU, and just has EU lenses on. That's not true. And when you look at what France has been doing in NATO these last years, since 2016, in the reassurance missions, which it has reinforced by sending 500 troops in Romania, 200 in Estonia, doing these air surveillance missions, Rafale in the skies of Estonia, Poland, and Romania. I think France is actually playing or acting or working with these different formats: NATO, EU, US-EU bilateral cooperation, France-US bilateral cooperation, Weimar Triangle, France, Germany, Poland. And these different formats or coalitions either work together or next to one another, but the aim is to actually be quite pragmatic, to work through the formats that work best in one given situation. And it's true that, and we see how NATO is perceived as very problematic and toxic by Putin. In certain circumstances, NATO is maybe not the best, if I can say, operationalizing framework. It's the same in the southern flank. Having a NATO intervention in Africa and the Middle East is maybe not the best framework. And so this is where the French narrative is to say, well, in certain situations, especially when Washington will say, sorry, but you know what's happening in Mali or what's happening in another country, it's not a US vital interest, but we Europeans are directly threatened by that crisis, then we need to act by ourselves. And so it's anticipating these scenarios. And it's something that France has been really impulsing within the EU, but it's not at all anti-US or anti-NATO. It's about anticipating these scenarios that will become much more, I would say, frequent in the years to come, as the US will need to prioritize its points of interventions and geographical focuses.
Thanks, Alexandra. Edgar, how is sort of the Washington perspective on sort of this renewed push for European defense, increased defense spending, strategic autonomy? Is it a zero-sum game? Is it seen as something positive, as Alexandra has seen something, you know, there are different variables and one has to be flexible, and the more flexible one is, the more options one has?
Yeah, I think quite frankly, the United States views France's push to become a little more sovereign, not in terms of being independent from the United States, but finding a European approach to complement, as Alexandra was alluding to, a more multilateral approach. I think it's welcome with open arms, especially post-AUKUS. I think we saw in President Biden's statement, him welcoming after AUKUS, explicitly calling out US support for European defense, for France's approach to a sort of comprehensive European defense policy. What I do want to say, though, is I think Alexandra is right in that President Macron does view sort of a more multilateral approach, not just in NATO, but sort of a broader approach to global challenges. I think one of the problems we, some in the United States has with regards to that approach is the more outreach you have to multiple arenas and multiple forums, the more difficult it is to really have a comprehensive approach to particular problem sets, whether it's Russia, whether it's China. And so I think what the United States is really looking for is a couple things. It's still unclear to Washington what Macron wants, both from European sovereignty and also how President Macron views a post-Russia-Ukraine security architecture. He sort of hinted at this. He has said that he wants to build it between Europeans and then share it with allies in the NATO framework and then propose it forward to Russia. But what does that actually look like? And he himself has criticized sort of our singular view of this problem through a NATO lens as a Cold War mentality. And in that sense, I think he is trying to broaden the approach to Russia. The problem is, I think we haven't yet heard what his ultimate political objectives are and how we can take those political objectives and translate that into these multilateral forums that he has, whether it's France, US, France, NATO, France leading the EU defense initiative. We don't really know what that looks like. And so Alexandra knows I say this a lot, and those in GMF Paris know I say this a lot, but if Macron does not step up to articulate what he wants and what he needs in a clear fashion, then the United States is we're going to try to understand in our own terms what Macron wants. And that is not going to benefit the France-US relationship, because I can almost assure you we're going to get it wrong. So over to Macron to clearly articulate what he wants in a post-Russia-Ukraine security architecture.
Okay, so that's someone must be taking notes of that request. I'm going to turn to the questions asked by the audience. There is Susan Stewart from Stiftung Wissenschaft Politik in Berlin, and she's asking, why did it take this war for France and Germany in brackets to realize what Putin and his regime are capable of? Is there anything that experts in the two countries, including myself in this category, could have done to convince French and German politicians of the nature of this regime before the war broke out? So a sort of self-critical remark, why did France and Germany not see the real threat, and what can we do about it?
Well, I think for France, it's really a question of geography. And in fact, in most of our security defense white papers that were published this last year, in the introduction, you have a very clear southern outlook to security defense challenges. And that's because of our geography. And I can tell you how many times I have, brought together in Atlantic or European seminars, people from the French government with Polish, Italians, Baltics, Sweden, Norwegian, expert. And it's true that, geography determines how you perceive threats, and France earnings that came from what we call the eastern flank. And now it is being taken more seriously because there is really a history, of a relationship with Russia that Merkel really personified for Germany's dependence vis-a-vis, the same extent that the COVID-19 crisis revealed our hyper-dependencies vis-a-vis China in many critical domains. This Ukraine-Russia war also highlights our unbearable dependencies vis-a-vis Russia, and especially hydrocarbons and in particular Russian gas. So our dependencies with authoritarian powers will one day backlash and have a boomerang effect on your own countries, including your own security and safety. And so, this big narrative that a lot of Europeans have been, slightly mocking coming from the Biden administration. He arrived saying, the world is this sort of battle between democracies and authoritarian states. I think he is right, because we need to redefine our relationships and our economic, energetic dependencies vis-a-vis these countries, and ask the question, what geopolitical impact, what security impact these dependencies have on our own societies, right? So these are the kind of reflection that we need to have. And at the EU level, the summit in Versailles that Macron hosted just a few days ago was very much about initiating, finally, an energy strategy for the EU in terms of diversifying our energy supplies away from Russia, you see? So I agree. I mean, I can understand the question and the frustration, because I think a lot of us share it, but unfortunately it's in moments of crisis, conflict, and here war, that political leaders realize the cost, the political security, moral costs of our country's dependencies vis-a-vis authoritarian countries.
Thanks. We're moving on to the next question, maybe for Edgar. Someone is asking, is it realistic to expect that Russia can be drawn away from China? All efforts made in this direction have yielded no results. So maybe the Russia-China relationship, is that a done deal?
So I think that's a very good question. It's one that I know we in capitals, in particular in European capitals in the United States, we are facing today. I think realistically, we really have to look at how China views this crisis. And I think that is something that I know my GMF colleague, Bonnie Glaser, has written about, but not much has been written about, and not much is quite understood about what China wants from this. My personal opinion is that China is seeking this opportunity to sort of exploit the disunity within Europe and with the United States. They intended to exploit the disunity within Europe and with the United States on the Russia problem set. I think there was a rude awakening when they realized that there's actually more unity than not. I think they're looking very closely at what impact Russia's actions are having on China's own economic well-being. There is controversy right now about whether we should take at heart what Chinese political figures are saying publicly. But just to reiterate what Wang Yi, the foreign minister, actually said, and he said that, we do not want to be impacted by Russia's behavior in terms of sanctions. But again, the Chinese are used to exploiting fissures within the United States and European allies and within Europe. I think what the European Union can do now to actually demonstrate to China that it is quite serious is, after the April 1 EU-China summit, really come to terms with what punitive measures the EU is willing to undertake in the event that China takes more aggressive actions in supporting Russia. I'm not talking necessarily about arms sales, because quite frankly, no amount of Chinese arms, I think, is going to turn the tide in this Russia-Ukraine crisis. But I'm talking about the long-term strategic approach. I'm talking about whether or not, China is going to seek to have it both ways, be friends with Russia and be friends with the European Union. I think the European unions can now step up, as many of the Eastern European bloc in the EU have already been doing, in really challenging the premise that the EU needs China more than China needs the EU. Whether that happens remains to be seen, but I think April 1st is a good opportunity, and I think the strategic compass is a good opportunity to draw out what this looks like in the next 5 years.
True. Alexandra, we'll take one last question, and it's for you. Since we've started a bit late, we can also run over a couple of minutes, and that was about a really interesting question about the Balkans. You've spoken about the Balkans before, the prospect of EU enlargement, and one person in the audience asked, but wasn't Macron one of the big opponents to EU enlargement in the Balkans? Are the recent remarks from Le Drian to Osmani about negotiations with North Macedonia a sign of change of attitude? So what about the French position about the Balkans? Is it changing?
I think there is a real awareness, and it's something that Macron has stated pretty clearly at the beginning of his presidency, that the EU has neglected for now several years the Balkan region. And in fact, the Balkans have been increasingly exposed to both Chinese and Russian influence. And so we are again in a policy of catching up, if I can say, and of repairing an absence of strategy for the Balkans. What's a bit concerning to see is to see that the war in Ukraine is reviving tensions in the Balkans. You see it in Bosnia Herzegovina, where the EU actually took the recent decision to double the number of military in the EU4, the European peace mission in Bosnia-Herzegovina, because there are some increasing tensions. You have countries like Moldova, who is increasingly preoccupied by maybe being the next in what could potentially be a domino effect. You have Serbia trying to balance between the West and Moscow. You have Kosovo with Pristina asking the United States to reinforce its military presence, the integration in NATO. So you have a whole constellation of countries in the Balkans who are now moving and being extremely preoccupied. But I think that it's also a consequence of this sort of neglect that both the EU and the US have been in these last couple of years. So I think there has been a real lack of strategy from the part, especially of Western European countries, for the Balkans, and I would say the overall eastern flank of both the EU and NATO these last couple of years. And, you know, I've been discussing with many leaders of Scandinavian, France, Germany, and even Italians and Spanish, and they said, you know, we recognize we have not been investing enough efforts, diplomatic, political, economic efforts with our partners of Eastern and Central Europe. And they have become permeable these last years to Russian and Chinese influence. But again, it's about catching up with things that have not been done and that should have been done these last couple of years. And it's a pity that we need this war to realize that.
Very true. And I think with this, we will close since we're running out of time. I wanted to thank the panel for being with us, and for the audience for listening to the panel. I'm sorry if I was not able to take on all the questions you were asking, but I all hope you've found this informative, and I hope you have a good evening. So bye from Paris.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph.
Bye-bye.